No, it's fine, it's only been 8 months since I covered DC Universe. Once again, we're exploring the outcomes of every fight in a NetherRealm story mode, MK9 in this case, and trying to figure out who the biggest loser of the story is. For the general rundown of how this works, go watch the DC Universe video. The rules here are the same, with a few additions. This game introduces handicap matches. I considered having these count as 2 losses for the losers because of how pathetic they are, but ultimately chose against it. I'll still note it each time though to highlight how big a loser the losers are. The Sub-Zeros have 2 forms each. These forms count as 1 character. It's about characters, not movesets. Otherwise, Shang Tsung morphing into Bi-Han would be a loss for Sub-Zero. The deaths in the opening scene occurred outside of the game, so I won't count them. Only the fights that occur within the confines of the narrative count. Also, I need to address that I messed up the result last time. I said Lex Luthor and Flash won for having the most wins with less losses than their contemporaries. I forgot that Liu Kang had the exact same result. There were 3 winners who all end up involved with Quan Chi in the end, weird. Anyway, on to the actual first NetherRealm story mode, despite me calling DCU one, which is a detail quite a few people were mad about last time for some reason. Scorpion defeats Kung Lao, defeats Nightwolf, defeats Sector and Cyrax, defeats Bi-Han, loses alongside Quan Chi to Liu Kang, loses to Kuai Liang, and loses to Raiden. That's a ratio of 5-3, which is a fair bit better than last time. Liu Kang defeats Ermac, defeats Katana, defeats Quan Chi and Scorpion, defeats Goro, defeats Shang Tsung, defeats Shiva off-screen, defeats Shao Kahn, and loses to Raiden. That's 8-1. This is what he's actually like when he's not forced to make Batman look good. Kung Lao loses to Scorpion, defeats Noob Saibot, defeats Goro, defeats Shang Tsung and Quan Chi, defeats Kintaro, and loses alongside Katana and Nightwolf to Raiden. That's 5-2. Kuai Liang defeats Cyrax, defeats Ermac, defeats Reptile, defeats Scorpion, loses to Cabal, defeats Sector, defeats Goro and Kintaro, defeats Ermac again, and defeats Noob Saibot. That's 9-1. As many wins as he had matches last time. Very good. Sindel loses to Nightwolf. That's 0-1. Remember, one-shots and beatdowns don't count, only real fights. Ermac loses to Liu Kang, loses to Sub-Zero, defeats Johnny Cage in a cutscene, loses to Stryker, and loses to Cyber Sub-Zero. That's 1-4. Remember when those exact odds were actually in his favour? Reptile loses to Johnny Cage, loses alongside Shang Tsung to Smoke, loses to Sub-Zero, and loses to Stryker. That's 0-4. Katana loses alongside Jade to Sonya, loses to Liu Kang, loses to Smoke, defeats Johnny Cage and Smoke, defeats Jade, defeats Mileena, defeats Shang Tsung, and loses alongside Nightwolf and Kung Lao to Raiden. That's 5-4. I mean, at least she gets to win this time. Johnny Cage defeats Reptile, defeats Baraka, defeats Sonya, defeats Kano, loses to Cyrax, loses to Jax, loses alongside Smoke to Katana, and loses to Ermac in a cutscene. His fight with Motaro, while destined for failure, is interrupted. That's 4-4. Jade loses alongside Katana to Sonya, loses to Jax, loses to Katana, defeats Baraka, defeats Shiva, defeats Mileena, and defeats Smoke. That's 4-3. Mileena loses to Katana, loses to Jade, loses to Stryker, and loses alongside Noob to Cabal. That's 0-4. Nightwolf loses to Scorpion, defeats Quan Chi, defeats Noob in a cutscene, defeats Cyrax, defeats Sector, defeats Sindel, and loses alongside Katana and Kung Lao to Raiden. That's 5-2. Cyrax loses alongside Sector to Scorpion, defeats Shiva, defeats Baraka, defeats Johnny Cage, defeats Sector, loses to Kuai Liang, and loses to Nightwolf. That's 4-3. So much for the improvements of the Cyber Initiative. Bi-Han loses to Sonya, loses to Scorpion, loses to Kung Lao, loses alongside Mileena to Cabal, loses to Cyber Sub-Zero, and loses to Nightwolf in a cutscene. That's an embarrassing 0-6. Smoke defeats Katana, defeats Kano, defeats Shang Tsung and Reptile, defeats Sector, loses alongside Johnny to Katana, loses to Jade, and loses to Sector in a cutscene. That's 5-3. Sector loses alongside Cyrax to Scorpion, loses to Cyrax, loses to Smoke, loses to Cyber Sub-Zero, defeats Smoke in a cutscene, and loses to Nightwolf. That's 1-5. Sonya Blade loses to Johnny Cage, defeats Bi-Han, defeats Raiden, defeats Katana and Jade, defeats Kano, and never fights a named character again after Chapter 2. That's 4-1. Same wins but less losses. Good on her. Jax defeats Baraka, defeats Johnny Cage, defeats Jade, defeats Shiva, and loses alongside Stryker and Cabal to Raiden. That's 4-1. Slight improvement. Kano loses to Johnny Cage, loses to Sonya, loses to Smoke, and loses to Cabal. That's 0-4. Same as last time. Stryker defeats Reptile, defeats Mileena, defeats Kintaro, defeats Ermac, and loses alongside Jax and Kabal to Raiden. That's 4-1. Shang Tsung loses to Liu Kang, loses alongside Reptile to Smoke, loses to Kitana, and loses alongside Quan Chi to Kung Lao. His fight with Raiden is off-screen and has no confirmed victor. That's 0-4. Easily the biggest downgrade. Baraka loses to Johnny Cage, loses to Cyrax, loses to Jax, and loses to Jade. That's 0-4. Somehow worse than last time? Good thing he doesn't show up in the invasion. Kabal defeats Kano, defeats Mileena and Noob, defeats Cyber Sub-Zero, defeats Shiva, and loses alongside Jax and Stryker to Raiden. That's 5-1. Raiden loses to Shao Kahn in the intro, loses to Sonya, defeats Scorpion, defeats Jax, Stryker and Kabal, defeats Kitana, Nightwolf and Kung Lao, defeats Liu Kang, and defeats Shao Kahn. That's 9-2. Triple the wins and one less loss. Shiva loses to Cyrax, loses to Jax, loses to Jade, loses to Liu Kang off screen, and loses to Kabal. That's 0-5. Quan Chi loses alongside Scorpion to Liu Kang, loses alongside Shang Tsung to Kung Lao, and loses to Nightwolf. That's 0-3. Goro loses to Liu Kang, loses to Kung Lao, and loses alongside Kintaro to Cyber Sub-Zero. That's 0-3. Kintaro loses to Kung Lao, loses to Stryker, and loses alongside Goro to Cyber Sub-Zero. That's 0-3. Shao Kahn defeats Raiden in Armageddon, loses to Liu Kang, and loses to Raiden. That's 1-2. Now we'll look over the data and find our ultimate conclusions. The fighter with the most fights is Raiden with 11. The fighter with the least fights is Sindel with 1. The most overdone matchups are Kuai Liang vs Ermac, and technically Sub-Zero vs Scorpion. Kuai Liang beats Ermac both times, while Sub-Zero vs Scorpion is evenly matched. I'll cut Raiden vs Shao Kahn some slack because only one is playable. The fighters with the most wins are Raiden and Kuai Liang with 9 each. The fighters with the least wins are Baraka, Bi-Han, Goro, Kano, Kintaro, Mileena, Quan Chi, Reptile, Shang Tsung, Shiva, and Sindel, all with 0. The strongest ratio is Kuai Liang at 9-2. The most balanced ratio is Johnny Cage at 4-4. The fighter with the most losses is Bi-Han with 6.
I do not lose. Huh?
The fighters with the least losses are Jax, Kabal, Kuai Liang, Liu Kang, Nightwolf, Sindel, Sonya, and Stryker with 1 each. The weakest ratio is Bi-Han because he's a fucking bitch. So, our final conclusion is that Kuai Liang is the winner of Mortal Kombat 9, despite what all the marketing would have you believe, tying for most wins and least losses, and having the strongest ratio to himself. Meanwhile, the other Sub-Zero is the biggest loser, with the most losses, surpassing the second place by 2 and 0 wins. Take it away, Terminator.
Here is Sub-Zero! Now, Plane Zero!
Check the pinned comment to see if I made any mistakes this time. Yeah, if. Next episode is Injustice 1, which will likely have 2 counts, one for character overall, and one for regime character and prime character as separate characters. Oh, how fun. If you liked this video, why not subscribe and support me on Patreon like these fine people here? If not, then make sure to share it with your enemies so they can suffer along with you. Today's recommended video is Mortal Kombat 2011 Sucks by Sonic XD, because 1, I've got to look out for my boys, and 2, it's just 30k away from 1 million views. Go watch or rewatch this and help this man soar.